Alright guys, what is up? It is a beautiful spring day. Let's jump right in. So on Tuesday we went over the United Nations, its background, the role it plays today, how the US interacts with it, and its effects and its criticism. So the big one being that it doesn't do enough to prevent war crimes. What we will be focusing on today is other IOs. So what they are, what they do, and criticism and more general theory around them. I would say that aside from the UN, which kind of does both of these things, most IOs or international organizations fall into one of two camps. There are the policy oriented ones, so they focus on the promotion of things, and then international law, where they focus on banning things. Real common one you'll see that's more policy oriented is called a non-governmental organization or an NGO. And what they look like is it's an international organization, obviously without governmental actors. World Wildlife Fund we talked about, Heifer International, Doctors Without Borders. We talked about how the WWF tries to protect the environment and how it had its strange lawsuit with the World Wrestling Federation. I don't follow wrestling, and aside from like The Rock, I can't really name any wrestlers. So I don't know what the World Wrestling Federation's called anymore. For International and Doctors Without Borders both run more like charities. It's essentially what they are, nonprofits. Um, but Heifer International tries to donate heifers or female cows to different villages with the idea that it can be more sustainable than donating money, because a heifer makes milk, makes baby cows, can do work, whereas once you spend money, it's gone. Now, I think I've mentioned before, my French has gotten to be terrible over the years, but Médecins Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Borders, so volunteer doctors who travel. So if you take the UN, which doesn't have a profit incentive, and take out the government parts of the UN, you have stuff like NGOs. But they're nonprofit. Now, if you take an NGO, so no government's involved, and then make it for profit, what you've essentially got is a multinational corporation or a multinational business. And so that's most big businesses you can think of, right? So some examples were Microsoft, BlackRock, McDonald's, Apple. It's really one of those things you don't want to overthink. Of course, Microsoft makes computers. BlackRock does a little bit of everything. And McDonald's achieves world peace through hamburgers. Or at least it did until McDonald's theory collapsed. Um, so yeah, quick question. What was McDonald's theory again? I'm just kidding. I know you can't answer me. But yeah, remember McDonald's theory and its close relation to democratic peace theory, which is the more formal one. Now, that level of international organization is based more around promotion of stuff. If you're McDonald's, you're promoting profit. If you are Heifer International, you're promoting sustainable development in the third world. International law is the other side of that. It's more focused on the prevention of things. And it's mainly built around this spectrum between autonomy and order. So on one level you have autonomy, or the ability to do whatever you want without breaking international law, because you haven't agreed to any international laws, because you're completely autonomous. So North Korea isn't signed to a lot of treaties, so it can do whatever it wants without being subject to international law in these certain fields. Order is the other extreme, though. It's you give up all your autonomy on the promise that it's going to make a more orderly world. Um, so autonomy, if you go full to the left on autonomy, everyone is free, but they're free to mess with as much stuff as they want. If you go far to the right with order, it's the opposite problem. Nobody's free at the expense of it being peaceful, but even then, the promise isn't always carried through because people who rule the society um, can end up abusing it. Basically, talk to any communist country, and you'll see what I mean. So, international law is about finding the spot on this spectrum that works best for your country. And it's all built around these costs and benefits. If something has a lower cost than benefit, it's a good deal. What is the cost of saying I will not use chemical weapons to a state that does not use chemical weapons? It's zero, right? To put it in a more real world scenario, it's I don't have a motorbike anymore. I used to, but not anymore. So if I tell my insurance company I promise not to drive a motorbike, they might give me a discount on my insurance because the risk goes down. Uh, and what does that cost me to do that? Nothing, because I don't own a motorbike anymore. Or, it, yeah, it's not zero since they might want to use chemical weapons in the future. It's not zero because I might want a motorbike in the future, and if they find out, they'll be upset. But it's effectively zero, especially in the short term. And the benefits either, so with the motorbike example, we'll stick with that. Lower insurance premiums. How is that like agreeing to not use chemical weapons? Well, if it becomes normalized, then you live in a society where nobody uses chemical weapons. And everyone would be expected to benefit from that. Now, that's the underlying logic behind these international laws called the Geneva Conventions. But it's a series of 4 agreements divided into over 400 articles that most states signed to regulate behavior in war. Most of these are centered around preventing violence on innocent people. Others prevent the inhumane treatment of soldiers during war. And others demand rules for war, so uniforms, gathering intel from POWs. I believe I have at least one student in this course who is an active duty service. So I'm sure he loves me lecturing about what war is and all that, as if I actually know. But I do know that, at least the way it used to be, it probably still is, POWs are told to only say their name, rank, and serial number if they're captured. Um, the uniforms is an interesting one too. The court case we had talked about earlier, about Guantanamo Bay, one of the Bush administration's logic behind it was that soldiers have to wear uniforms. So if terrorists aren't wearing uniforms, then they aren't soldiers. So the Geneva Convention doesn't apply to them. The Supreme Court did not agree. No, like I said, it's not just one agreement. It's a series of 4 agreements, and some states are committed to some, but not others. Basically, all of them are committed to the 1949 Geneva Conventions. And so, to a certain level, they get to pick how invested they want to be in it. Then we talk about regulating war. Let's go into more detail. What does that actually look like? A big one is weapons that are banned by the Geneva Conventions. Um, Sort of a weird one to start with is the triangular bayonet. You don't really see these in anything past, well, you don't see anything, and I don't see anything because none of us were around before 1949, I would expect. But even in movies and stuff, you really don't see these outside of like Revolutionary War movies and stuff like that. And maybe it's a chicken egg thing. They have been phased out of warfare since then. And they're considered cruel because a triangular bayonet is almost impossible to stitch up. So whoever you stick with it just keeps bleeding. Most shotgun rounds are also banned. So slug shotguns or like the one solid round is fine. Um, but anything with the ball bearings and like a standard buckshot or birdshot is banned under the Geneva Convention because it's too difficult to operate on, as opposed to like one bullet. Now, I want to expand on chemical weapons because it was, of course, a big deal in World War One, and people saw how this was going, how it would literally poison the earth. So, especially in around Flanders Fields in France, uh, you can grow stuff there. You just can't eat anything that grows there because it's been so ravaged with chemical weapons that even today it's not safe to use this really good, otherwise good farmland for food. So the idea was is prevent this from the old saying was salt the earth. This is even worse than salting the earth. Uh, but that doesn't mean chemical weapon attacks still don't happen. Now this is before the Geneva Convention, um, but can anybody think of what the biggest, most widespread chemical weapon attack in U.S. history was? It was the smallpox blankets given to Native Americans. Um, so intentionally infecting them with smallpox and decimating the community. Now the second one, can anyone think what the second biggest would be? Well, if you were paying attention during the 9/11 part of the class, you would remember about the anthrax attacks in 2001, around the same time as 9/11. So that was a total of 5 dead, 17 injured. So that's a pretty dramatic drop off. And with hindsight being 2020, we know that it likely didn't have anything to do with the September 11th attacks. It was just weird timing. But at the time, it was used, as you can see here in the UN, to justify the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq. And then the third one, so less than 5 kills, was this cult called Rajneeshpuram. I'm pretty sure I'm pronouncing that right. But it was a cult of yoga hippies who put salmonella in salad bars in 1984. Um, Despite 0 deaths, that's 751 people infected, 45 hospitalized. And if the leader looks familiar, I believe his name is Osho, but if he looks familiar from a certain meme that I can't repeat here, uh, you are correct. He is that guy from the meme that was bouncing around a few years ago. He died in 1990, so it is kind of weird that the meme started circulating again. I guess it wouldn't circulate in the 90s though, because the internet wasn't that widespread. Now, at first, this might look like some sort of Halo cosplay or Destiny cosplay. At least the gun does. But no, that's an actual gun that the U.S. military was experimenting with, made to blind pilots. So it shoots a powerful laser, not like a Star Wars laser that blows stuff up, but one that's meant to blind people. Of course, blinding people is a war crime, or any kind of weapon designed to blind people like that is actually a war crime. Shooting them, a-okay, but you can't blind them. Um, I remember when I worked at Barnes and Noble, uh, teenagers would come in and shine laser pointers in our eyes, and there wasn't a lot we could do. So, am I a victim of war crimes? Absolutely. No, I'm kidding. Well, we'll get to that in a second, but yeah, I can still see absolutely fine. This one has a lot of range. Incendiary weapons. Of course, this has been around since ancient times. Lighting bows and arrows on fire, stuff like that. Uh, but it does have a lot of applications. I don't know who in the hell thought it was a good idea to set a flamethrower to a robot, but there you go. At least I hope that's not real. Um, they got to be widespread in modern warfare in World War One, for two main reasons. One was the flamethrower. Well, the flamethrower made it widespread for two reasons. One was to clear out bunkers. You didn't have to do uh, waste a grenade on it or anything like that. You could just hit a bunker with it, and anyone that was inside would be running out. The other one was that a lot of people would pretend to be dead. And so if you hit them with a flamethrower, then they can't pretend to be dead for very long. On the bottom left, that's white phosphorus grenades, nicknamed Willie Pete. Um, to burns super, super hot. I believe it was last used in the Vietnam War. And we'll get to why people break international law like that in a minute. And then top left is Dresden. So firebombed, German city firebombed by the United States toward the end of the war. I believe it had more deaths than either Hiroshima. It beat one of the two Japanese cities, Hiroshima or Nagasaki, in terms of amounts of deaths, despite using conventional weapons. And then napalm was sort of, I mean, it's almost like a symbol of the Vietnam War, just how hot this burns. And how hot it burns seems like it would be a moot point, but it burns hotter than fire and is more difficult to get rid of because it's when it's not combusting, it looks like jello and sticks. This never made it past the design phase. It was never actually implemented. But in World War II, in the Pacific Theater, there was a plan to use a bat bomb, which sounds like something that Batman would use if he was a bit more edgy. But the idea behind the bat bomb was actually quite interesting. I don't know if it's based off this, but Queen Olga of Kiev had a similar idea where she would take birds, pigeons mainly, from a city she was attacking, tie little flaming strings to them, and then set the birds free. They would fly into the city, and their nests would act as kindling, and that would just burn the entire city. Um, and yeah, she is a saint in the Catholic Church now too. Interesting lady. Now the bat bomb was the same except with bats, and the idea was to have little napalm canisters on their legs, and then drop them in this parachuted bombs. They'd have enough time to get out of it, and they would fly under these pagodas or that kind of roof that is almost perfect for bats to hang outside from. And then it would essentially light Japan ablaze. Now, it's another reason why incendiary weapons are banned, though, is because they tend to hit civilians more. There's no pagoda-shaped military buildings in Japan at this time. These are all civilian buildings and buildings of historical importance that the Allies don't want to blow up. So that's why it was never actually used. Um, Also, you probably know this if you've seen Oppenheimer, the US tended not to target historic sites. So Dresden was super industrial, Nagasaki, Hiroshima were super industrial. I'd say Nagasaki is the most historic out of all of them because it was a big trading port back in the day. It's the biggest hub for Japanese Christians too, because of all the Western influence in Nagasaki. But it's been rebuilt. Expanding from the Geneva Conventions, though, there's the Convention Against Landmines in 1997. It seems pretty obvious in retrospect, but especially as war got to be more asymmetric. So guerrillas versus tanks or something like that. Landmines got to be used less for their intended purpose, like in World War One, where they would just be used to deny a land area to both sides. to purposely being hidden and blowing people up. Um, we've talked about this in the war chapter, but a lot of weapons aren't designed to kill; they're designed to maim, and a lot of landmines are that way. Because if someone's dead, the army loses one person, but if someone's wounded, then they lose three people. There's the wounded person, and then the two people who have to take care of him. The problem is this is one, not always wounds. They do kill a lot of the time too. And two, this is when they're used on adults. Kids will see shiny objects, metal objects, go over and try to pick them up. Um, I assume we were all kids at one point, so you probably have memories of that. I remember my sister when she was little, she saw a jellyfish on the beach and picked it up, not thinking because she was a kid, and then that didn't end up well. But yeah, kids especially tend to go after landmines, and it obviously doesn't end well. So there's a big movement, especially coming from the leading up to and following the Convention Against Landmines in 1997. The last time I could think of that they were used widespread was the Cambodian genocide in the 80s. Now, I went to Cambodia in 2017, and the area is still full of landmines, just how many were used. And so you'll see signs like this all over the place in Cambodia still today. And so you have all this land that's just completely wasted that could be used for industry, that could be used for housing. No, it's just uninhabitable until they're able to get the resources to clear out the mines. And even then, they don't always get 100% of the mines. Related to that is cluster munitions. Made a war crime in 2008 by most states. A cluster munition is like this. It's not one big bomb, it's a ton of little bombs. And the idea is the movie Armageddon explains it well. Imagine blowing up a firecracker on your hand, just on the top of your hand, versus one inside a closed fist. The second one's probably going to hurt more. And so with cluster munitions like this, they're able to get behind stuff and into bunkers and stuff like that, and just cause more chaos by not blowing up in one direction, but in every direction. Now, the problem with having dozens and dozens and dozens of small bombs spreading out all over the place is, well, some of them are duds. Some of them are still dangerous but don't explode. And like with landmines, they can just be in this area forever. So that's an idea of how they work. So especially effective at blowing up buildings. Because instead of blowing up, going on with the hand metaphor, instead of going and like blowing up on the side of a building, a lot of the bombs will go inside the building and blow it up from the inside. I know this got to be a heated debate again a few years ago because right before the lines sort of started to settle in Ukraine, Ukraine actually brought back a bunch of cluster munitions and started using them again. So even if peace were to be declared tomorrow in Ukraine, there would still be issues with cluster munitions basically infecting tons of areas of land. Now, I've never been to Eastern Europe, but I'm told this is a pretty common sight where you can just see decommissioned um, war crime weapons that have been decommissioned since the end of World War or end of the Cold War, but they'll just be laying around. So it's decommissioned. So this isn't actually dangerous, but it's still just a weird relic of a much different time. Now, it's not unique to cluster munitions or landmines. Unexploded ordnance can still affect areas for years, decades, even over 100 years. And this is really all it takes. If somebody finds this thing, they don't know what it is, they pick it up to take a closer look at it, and then that can be all it takes to set them off and then kill a person and possibly whoever is next to them. Um, And a lot of people will see stuff like that or hear about stories like that and think like, oh, well, that doesn't affect me. I live in America. We never used cluster munitions on U.S. soil. To my knowledge, there's never been any landmines used on U.S. soil. So how could that possibly affect me? Well, this problem isn't unique to landmines or cluster munitions. It's any unexploded ordnance. Well, it's actually a lot closer to home than you think. So yeah, this was 2020, a live mortar round found in Concord Park in Knoxville. Um, to anyone who knows Knoxville, this is around the Farragut area. During the Civil War, there was the Battle of Campbell Station around there. Tons of mortars used. When my family lived there, we actually found a not mortar shell, but a solid shot, so it can't detonate. But we found one of those in our backyard. So good luck to whoever lives in that area now. I want to say like 20 years ago this happened. No, it was more than that. Because I was still like a real little kid. Um, Somebody was walking along Concord Park and they found a mortar round and picked it up. Already, they're insanely lucky they didn't die right then. But assuming it was safe, they Concord Park has a library right next to it. They picked it up, brought it into the library, and said, "Hey, look at this." Someone who had presumably taken an IR class exactly knew what the issue was, and the bomb squad had to be called to the library next to Concord Park. So nobody died, insanely lucky, but it's still very concerning. And this is not cluster munitions, by the way. Cluster munitions just make this problem 100 times worse. So especially if you have any friends or family in Ukraine, please tell them to be careful, even after the active war there ends. Now, talk about war a lot in this because it is sort of my focus, but there's other types of international law. Maritime, environmental, trade and economic, diplomatic, nuclear, and torture, or just overall intelligence community. So let's go into more detail with these. Now, the two of you who've actually seen Arrested Development will remember maritime law with the trial of Captain Hook. And if you haven't seen Arrested Development, I don't know if it's aged well or not, but I still very much enjoy it. But what it mainly focuses on is how far away from the coast you are and what rights that guarantees a country. So territorial sea, exclusive economic zone, and high seas. And so as you go further out, different things become legal and illegal. And because the sea is such a huge resource, that states benefit a ton from it. And the whole joke in Arrested Development is that maritime law is kind of a weird thing to focus on. A lot of people are probably thinking, who gives a shit? And the answer would be basically every state in the South China Sea has different claims in different parts of the sea. All these different islands are disputed. And that, like with this big red line around what China claims, all this territory, all the oil under the water there, China thinks it has a specific claim to. So we'll see how this is disputed. I imagine how most of this ending is everybody involved dying of old age because it's just not going to be resolved. There's too much on the line. And then the climate side, environmental side of international law is, I don't know, more nice to talk about, I think. At least more pleasant to talk about. Because it is one of those things that benefits everybody. It's like how school, K through 12 school for all children is popular. You don't have to have children to benefit from it because we all benefit from society being more educated. Um, in that similar vein, you don't have to participate in these agreements without benefiting from the better environment that they cause. So the two big ones are Kyoto and Paris. Um, see, Kyoto is, I think, the more famous one, but Paris is more disputed. One of my favorite, one of my favorite jokes about Kyoto is like if you like anagrams, it's Tokyo. But what they both focus on is CO2 emissions and reducing them by countries. Now, where this gets to be spicy, though, is developed versus undeveloped states. So a lot of states that are still playing catch up to levels of development for different reasons are basically in their own industrial revolutions now, where not so nice factories, lots of burning coal, lots of burning trash, really, just burning everything, which is terrible for the environment. But they argue that, well, the United States and Europe especially already had their chance to do all that before it became an issue. So, what are they supposed to do? They need to have all these CO2 emissions to develop beyond CO2 emissions. And basically, the global West is in a place of privilege by telling them not to do that. So then there's the argument that the global West should pay the developing world to not do that and giving them some sort of financial incentive. Um, and I can tell you what the answer is. It's actually very simple. I'm joking. I don't actually have the answer. The United States famously withdrew from the Paris Agreement in 2017 um, because it hampers U.S. industry, and the president at the time um, wanted to focus more on the economy than the environment. And then the next president, so Trump to Biden, Biden very quickly signed on to rejoining the Paris Agreement. And then, of course, 4 years later, Trump won re-election, and believe it or not, withdrew again from the Paris Agreement January of last year. So um, the U.S. policy process in relation to a lot of these agreements is basically summarized in this next image. There we go. Let me in, let me out. It took all semester to get there, but we finally did a cat meme. Um, but jokes aside, though, it is very mercurial. A lot of U.S. foreign policy. We talked about this before, depending on who is president. And so, with these swing elections, we see more and more, like we talked about last week. We just went from Democrat to one-term Republican to one-term Democrat. Um, we're at a one-term Republican now. At least it's his second term, but it's not. Sorry about that. Non-consecutive, um, and it's looking more and more likely just based on current polls. It still is way too early to tell because I don't even know who the nominees are, but Democrats are expected to do well in the next presidential election. So we're going to see more of this mercurial, let me out, let me in attitude toward a lot of agreements because of that. And there's economic agreements, so like NAFTA, which helps, so the North American Free Trade Agreement, all the North American countries, well, at least the three main ones, having free flowing trade between all the borders. Um, this idea that economic cooperation is going to be a rising tide that lifts all boats and has everyone do well. And then diplomatic law. Um, yeah, for those of you who don't know what this image is, it's a scene from Lethal Weapon 2. But the villain in this movie he's a diplomat from South Africa uh, in the 80s. So not only is he super racist, supporting apartheid, but he also has diplomatic immunity, so the police can't arrest him for all the drug smuggling he's doing. Um, which, being a diplomat, a racist, and a drug smuggler, I don't know how this guy has any time in the day. But a lot of diplomatic law in real life, and not in a cheesy Hollywood movie that is actually still pretty good. Um, it's meant to prevent diplomats from being harassed by the host countries while they're staying at embassies and stuff like that. So as we talked about before, if I'm a diplomat in Russia without this diplomatic immunity, the Russian government can arrest me for petty stuff and interrogate me or whatever. Another big part of diplomatic law, though, is the embassies. An embassy is seen as sovereign territory to whoever the embassy belongs to. So the Chinese embassy in DC is technically Chinese soil. The American embassy in Beijing is technically American soil, stuff like that. And so it's kind of an open secret that embassies basically everywhere are just completely lousing with spies. Um, but it's sort of one of those, they call it a wash because everybody does it. But there's a little spycraft element to embassies. And there's the really spicy one that happened during the Carter administration. Iran has a revolution, an angry mob storms the embassy and takes the people there hostage. Now, people swarming a US embassy is tantamount to an invasion of the United States by Iran. And even if it's not literally that, it's legally that. And so this caused a huge crisis. And we saw something similar with the embassy attacks in 2012. We talked about the Benghazi raid, and that, of course, ended in the death of the ambassador, Chris Stevens. Now, I think people remember the Iran hostage crisis more, even though it was longer ago, because it's in the more dramatic backdrop of the Iranian Revolution itself, and it lasted a lot longer. Benghazi and its immediate aftermath only lasted a few days, where the hostage crisis lasted exactly 444 days. None of the hostages were actually killed, but there was a rescue operation called Operation Eagle Claw, where a bunch of helicopters and airplanes were both sent, well, were all sent to go help liberate the hostages. But there was a collision that killed 8 service members. So, um, massively embarrassing time for the Carter administration overall. And then I believe it ended. Now, 444 wasn't by design. It was just a weird coincidence. But what was by design and how it ended was it ended on January 20th, 1981, the same day as Ronald Reagan's inauguration day. So that's why, like, you hear, or during the last election, you heard President Trump, then candidate Trump, or former President Trump, talk about how Ukraine or Gaza or any of that would be over very quickly, is because the president actually did pull it off before. This one's pretty controversial also, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. That whole Arrested Development, not the TV show, but if states should be in Arrested Development because it's good for the environment. Um, what if it was that, but a security issue or a nuclear security issue? Uh, a bunch of states, not that many, but more than you would think, have signed on to agree to not make more nuclear weapons. Let's assume many states cheat on this. But it begs this bigger question in defense of the states cheating on it. Just because the United States, Russia, the nuclear powers uh, got to nuclear weapons first, does that give them the right to lead this international push to ban them for everybody else? One of the more, I would just flat out say, kooky ideas in international relations, Kenneth Waltz, said that if every state had nuclear weapons, it would achieve world peace. Nobody's really willing to take him up on that for obvious reasons, because if it goes wrong, it goes really wrong. But some states really do believe that they need nuclear weapons for their own security. Now, officially, there are 7 recognized states, or 7 states that are recognized to have nuclear weapons. Figured it could be kind of fun, even in this asynchronous, a fun challenge for yourself at least, to see if you can guess what they are. I put them in alphabetical order. So, first nuclear power state in alphabetical order is China. Technically, the People's Republic of China, but um, no one was actually thinking that, probably. All right, second one, France. Third one, India. The fourth one, alphabetically and geographically close to India, Pakistan. And then the fifth one, this was probably pretty easy, Russia. And then there's 2 more, the United Kingdom and the United States. Now, the reason I am very delicate about how I say there are 7 states recognized to have nuclear weapons is that there is an 8th state that is, I believe, basically accidentally admitted to having nuclear weapons, but they don't act as if they do have nuclear weapons, and it's this big debate that even though it's nuclear weapons and all that, it's still just too complicated of a debate to really care. But this isn't in alphabetical order, obviously, but it is Israel. So it has an asterisk by it. I think there was one case a few years ago, like early into the Gaza war, or conflict in Gaza, we'll call it, because nobody can agree what it's called. Beyond that, but an Israeli defense minister had said, we have all options on the table, and we have not ruled out the use or the potential use of nuclear weapons. And then he realized what he had said, and he says, not that we have any. So, yeah, that's an interesting one. Of the 7 that are recognized to have nuclear weapons, though, you can see a pretty consistent trend among them. This is especially prescient coming from the UN talk the other day. But if you notice, of the 7, 5 of them are on the UN Security Council. That being China, France, Russia, the UK, and the US. What's especially concerning, though, is the other 2, Pakistan and India. Anyone who knows anything about these 2 states knows that they do not get along because of the partition after the British left, leading to a lot of bad blood between the 2. About a year ago, actually, there was a terrorist attack between the two. I believe Pakistani terrorists attacked India, and it got to be very concerning because there was it never escalated to a full war, but there were attacks going on between Pakistan and India that people didn't know if they would escalate or not. I've said this before, the nice thing about escalation ladders is only a few things have to go right. And in this case, nuclear war, you'll be surprised to learn, did not break out between Pakistan and India. The different states have signed on to different levels of NPT. Most of them are either, what would we say, already nuclear powers or are closely aligned with nuclear powers to where, like, Canada, for example, doesn't need to worry about a nuclear program. Because if Canada needs to nuke somebody, they have friends who can do it. But another big part of it isn't the proliferation of nuclear weapons by creating more, but by spreading them out. So a bunch of other states have agreed not to host nuclear weapons, especially in Africa. Before we go on with this, let me finish that thought. Not hosting nuclear weapons is important because then, or without it, you get issues like the NATO missiles, nuclear weapons in Turkey that are just right on the Soviet doorstep. And then retaliation, the Soviet Union, of course, tried to put nuclear missiles in Cuba, prompting the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it's limiting the spread of nuclear weapons where they're actually kept is meant to reduce that risk. Anyway, CAT, or the CAT. It actually has little to nothing to do with our furry feline friends or outdated memes from 2006. It is the Convention Against Torture, so CAT. It's a treaty that says states will not torture, commit cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment around the world. Successfully defines torture to a way where all states can agree, kind of. Signed in 1884, came into effect in 1987. You can't help but wonder what all the years in between the two were like. Like, you always hear about the in offices, it's like, oh, we have to spend this $1,000 by the end of the year. They're going to cut our budget, so it's time to have a birthday party for Lorraine's cat. But it's like, okay, well, torture is illegal in 1987, so we better spend all of 1986 getting it out of our system. I hope that wasn't the case, but maybe. A ton of states have signed on to CAT, but that does not mean that they all follow it. Uh, Famously, Egypt is really big into torturing, and so the U.S. CIA especially doesn't have to threaten to torture people. A lot of the time, they just say, well, we have friends in Egypt. You're speaking to the prisoner, they'll just say, you're a wanted criminal in Egypt. We'll just send you to Egypt. And they don't need to torture people because it's the threat of torture, and that will get some people talking. If you ever see Zero Dark 30 or any of the stuff about hunting bin Laden, threats of sending people to Egypt were very common. And that isn't to say that the U.S. doesn't do any torturing. Guantanamo Bay, or the nickname Gitmo, which I never understood how that nickname made sense. But same with Robert being Bob and stuff like that, so who cares? But it was believed for a long time that, well, it's not believed, it's a fact that terrorists were taken to Guantanamo Bay, and it was believed that this was sort of the big hub for the CIA to interrogate terrorists with and without torture. During his presidential run a few years ago, the Trump campaign was trying to dig up dirt on DeSantis, and he was a lawyer or he worked in some sort of legal capacity around Guantanamo Bay before he was governor of Florida. And so they tried to use that as a cudgel against him, or I think that someone used it. Maybe it was the Democrats. But yeah, I remember Ron DeSantis was caught up in the Gitmo scandals. No, I am not one to throw stones about having a bad photo taken, but this is especially bad. Especially this was a film camera, not like on a cell phone or something, because iPhones were still a few years away from being invented. Um, but if you're going to be an accused war criminal, I guess he looks the part. This is a very creepy photo. A very creepy expression on his face. Anyway, this leads us to the talk about probably the most famous torturing scandal in the U.S. I would say is not actually Guantanamo Bay, but this because it was expected at Guantanamo Bay. But with this prison called Abu Ghraib, it was actually not expected. Now, Abu Ghraib was a prison in Iraq after the invasion, um, where it came out that these two, Lindy England and Charles Cranner, were torturing prisoners. They had taken a ton of photos of the prisoners, none of which I can even like even censoring the worst parts about them. It's a little too extreme to be showing students in this capacity. Um, but these are the two faces of it, and they're in a relationship. As you can tell by the last photo, they were in a relationship together at the time. I believe one of them was cheating on a spouse. I forgot which. Um, but they both received prison and dishonorable discharges for it. Uh, Aside from it being a human rights violation, the other big issue with Abu Ghraib was when the story came out, it inspired a lot of domestic terrorism. People who were already sympathetic toward terrorist causes saw this and then would go on to commit domestic terrorist acts and then explicitly blame the treatment of prisoners at Abu Ghraib for their motivation for doing the attacks. And a U.S. workaround, and this is specifically to the U.S., around torture was this method called waterboarding, which I think I've made this joke before, but waterboarding at Guantanamo Bay sounds absolutely rad if you don't know what either one of those things means. Um, but what waterboarding is you have to do it to someone in the Grand Theft Auto 5 campaign. If you look at it on the bottom right here, put a rag over someone's face and then pour water on them. And what it does is it activates the gag or reflex to not want to drown. So your body thinks it's drowning, even though you're perfectly fine. So the U.S. said that this doesn't technically count as torture, so they can waterboard whoever they damn well please. This British writer, Christopher Hitchens, who was already a celebrity at the time for his he was very big in the new atheist community and skeptics and all that. But he actually consented to being waterboarded, and he wrote this essay saying, "Believe me, it is torture." Now, from the intelligence community, this kicked off what was called the ticking bomb debate. And there's this hypothetical question of if you are 100% sure that there's a ticking bomb that will kill X people if detonated, and the only way to find where it is so you can save lives on time is to torture a terrorist. In that case, should you be allowed to torture? This is an argument mainly from the intelligence community and its supporters, which I don't have an answer to. It's worth thinking about. So you're probably wondering what actually does happen if you break international law. Not for your own plans for how the rest of your day is going to go, but just so you know how that all works. Well, the vast majority of the time, it's the same thing. Nothing. which isn't as bad as it sounds, I promise. The denominator is doing a lot of work there. Then you're prosecuted by your own country first. If your own country doesn't prosecute, um, it will lead to a reputation loss for your country a lot of the time. And then one of the more dramatic options is the International Criminal Court, or ICC. Now, when I talk about nothing happening not being as bad as it sounds, and I said the denominator does a lot of work there. The sample size is very big. By that I mean thinking about what a war crime is. One of the ones we talked about was chemical weapons. And most people instantly think, oh, like strychnine, anthrax, mustard gas. And those are all correct, but any weapon that is deployed as a chemical can be um, bear mace, or even pepper spray, or tear gas. And so if you use pepper spray, it's technically a war crime, but nobody actually really cares, as long as you use it legally and all that. Tear gas, well, the government uses tear gas on its own citizens sometimes. And there's no condemnation from the UN or anything like that. The other example, I talked about this earlier, is you can't use weapons that blind people. So the teenagers who used to shine lasers in my eyes when I was working at Barnes & Noble are technically war criminals. And the joke I was making earlier, of course, is that in the grand scheme of things, compared to like the Rwanda genocide, it's nothing. Because it is basically nothing compared to that. But still technically a war crime. Now, for the major scale ones, so a general goes into a village and slaughters a bunch of civilians. Um, the host state, or whatever country that general is from, let's say Russia, has one of two options. It can either prosecute these crimes themselves or not. So Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, for example, you'd have the Hind helicopters, these gunship helicopters flying around, and they'd be shooting civilians from these gunships, basically as a hobby, basically even for fun. There's that one scene in Full Metal Jacket. Anyone who is running from the helicopter is an enemy. Anyone who is standing still is a well-disciplined enemy. So the U.S. didn't prosecute a ton of that stuff. So what that led to was a loss of reputation for the U.S. And it never really made it to the point of international outrage that it would lead to anything more dramatic than this loss of reputation. And I know there's the joke I made earlier about, well, the UN will send you a strongly worded letter. Well, if you lose reputation, it actually does affect the amount of tourists who come, the amount of investment you get, and stuff like that. Which is nothing compared to human life, sure, but it's still within politics is a trade most states are willing to pay. And sometimes war crimes aren't actually prosecuted by the state responsible for the soldiers. Um, so there's an entire prison, Fort Leavenworth, that is basically a military prison. So it's for U.S. war criminals. Although I think most soldiers who end up going there have done crimes against other Americans, and it's just a specialized military prison. So, like if one serviceman kills another serviceman or something like that, then they'd go to Leavenworth. But the England and Craner, the two people who did the Abu Ghraib torturing, were prosecuted by the U.S. government. So international law didn't have to apply because the U.S. already had was already enforcing it. Okay, so what happens when someone does a war crime, big enough for people to care, and they're not prosecuted by their own country. Um, well, often their own country will protect them, and that's where it ends. Sometimes, especially in one situation, this will lead to people being brought to the International Criminal Court. And this condition is that the country wants to prosecute them, but just doesn't have the institutional capacity to do it. They don't have good enough prisons and courts and lawyers to do everything by the book. Then the International Criminal Court will step in and prosecute criminals for them. So example is Germain Katanga. We'll go into it. Katanga from the DRC, or Democratic Republic of Congo, was a leader of a group called the Patriotic Resistance Front of Ituri. I'm sure they said they had a noble cause, but a lot of these are just driven by greed. But they were associated, obviously, because this is a war crime section, of committing war crimes against civilians. This is the part of Congo they were, or the DRC they were operating in most of the time. But because he's a rebel leader, the government obviously doesn't like him. He's going around killing people. But the DRC doesn't have the ability to prosecute them themselves, so they sent him to the International Criminal Court. And kind of like that fictional character in Lethal Weapon 2, this guy is accused of doing so much stuff it makes you wonder how he had any time in the day to actually be a rebel leader. Willful killing, inhuman or cruel treatment, using children under the age of 15 to participate in active hostilities, or to participate actively in hostilities, sexual slavery, intentionally directing attacks against civilians, pillaging, and 3 counts of crimes against humanity, murder, inhumane acts, and sexual slavery. And here's the timeline. He committed the war crimes mostly in 2003. 2005, he's arrested by the government. 2007, he's transferred to the ICC, formally charged with the crimes. The trial begins in 2009. And his conviction, so how long the trial and deliberations and sentencing took, was 2014, so 11 years since the crimes were committed, which is a very, very slow time. It's like, well, he's been convicted of all sorts of stuff. As you can see here, he's convicted with basically everything he was charged with, but he's only sentenced to 12 years. The thing is, he'd already spent a bunch of that time already in prison waiting for his trial in the ICC. So he's released in 2015 to go to jail to the DRC for life, because the DRC can actually accommodate him by that point. So does the ICC do anything? And that leads to this big talk on, like, well, they did 12 years, but for this huge, huge, huge organization of all these different states, all these procedures, this novel application of the law. 12 years for all this stuff is not really a very long time at all. Granted, he's, I believe, still in prison in the DRC. But to a lot of people, this just doesn't feel like justice. Or prison for life does feel like justice, but the ICC should have been more active in it. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Paul, even though you're the best professor I ever had and made me want to change majors to poli-sci if I wasn't one already, maybe they aren't, or maybe they move so slow because they have so many cases. Well, excuse the pun, but that's not really the case either. Since it was founded, there have been a total of 51 defendants, 14 are still at large. So they don't have a very full docket, is my point. As you can see here, This is pretty out of date, but still not that many people end up going to trial and then getting convictions, and some of these convictions are very light. Um, so Katanga, you can see in that 2014 there, toward the bottom, 12 years. Some of these people, the accomplices of Gombo, who is from the same country as Katanga but worked for the government, one of his accomplices only got 6 months. Um, so the ICC, very, very slow. Some would say ineffective. So to review with the International Criminal Court, if a U.S. soldier commits a war crime in Iraq, who tries them? I'll give you 5 seconds. The U.S. States are primarily responsible for enforcing laws on their own people. Now, we've been over that, but here's a new one, and I want you to think about how all this works and see if you can come up with the right answer in your head before I tell you. Oh yeah, if not, it goes to the jurisdiction of the ICC in The Hague, Netherlands. The U.S. military is actually pre-authorized to invade the Netherlands anytime it wants, in case it needs to rescue war criminals, or what the U.S. would consider to be wrongfully prosecuted alleged war criminals who actually did nothing wrong. It's never been used, of course. We've never invaded the Netherlands since World War II when it was Nazi occupied, Operation Market Garden. But we've never liberated any war criminals from the Netherlands, and I'm very okay with that. But here's another one. What about Mexican drug cartel leaders in Mexico? So who's committing the crimes? Drug cartel leaders. Who's primarily responsible for that? Mexico. Well, there's still a huge problem with cartels in Mexico now. Why hasn't anything been done? Well, it's Mexico's responsibility. Mexico doesn't have the ability, then it would go to the ICC. So if a drug cartel leader was caught and Mexico couldn't give him or her a fair trial, which sounds kind of odd, but then you realize all the candidates who were assassinated during elections in Mexico, there realistically could be a scenario where a drug cartel leader is brought before the ICC. Warlords in failed states, same thing, it's a matter of actually being able to capture them. Now, some would say this is because it's institutionally racist, others would say it's an unfortunate coincidence caused by geography and history. But it is worth mentioning that the vast majority of people convicted at The Hague or the ICC, which is in Holland, which is in Europe, are not white. Only 51 cases have ever been heard, and they take a long time to play out. And even on like the local level, here in Knoxville, Tennessee, there's debate if regular convictions even prevent crime. There's the guy who stabbed the Ukrainian woman on the train who had been arrested like 14 times before. Does that prevent crime? Obviously not. He murdered a woman on camera. So that leads to, does international law even matter? If people are just going to break it and it's not going to be effective anyway. Now, if you've had any of my classes before, you know exactly where I was going with this. If you haven't had me before, glad to have you. But the answer to that is speed limits. Not literally, there's needs to be limits into how fast you can commit war crimes, but it's think about how many people actually follow the speed limit. I'm sure we all do. I know one of the students in this class is a retired cop, or a former cop, maybe not retired, but so to him I'll say, of course I always drive 45 and a 45. I never go 5 over everywhere I am. Joking, of course. Basically, everybody, even cops, go 50 and 45, 65 and 60. It's always five for some reason. But everyone breaks the law a little. It's just when the cases get to be very egregious. So we look at like all the cases of international law failing, or at least not meeting expectations, like the ICC. But then we realize, well, there has been a sizable decrease in the amount of chemical weapons, of incendiary weapons, of all these different things. It would be so easy to just blind people with lasers, and you wouldn't actually have to kill them. But we've all agreed not to do that. And the cost of us not doing that is we get to live in a society where other people don't do that. And if this is starting to sound like the social contract, it's basically because it is. You probably remember from 102, the whole social contract. We agree to follow rules because we all benefit from living in a society with rules. It's the same thing, but applied internationally. Going back to the case of Guantanamo Bay, or at least we'll say Cuba, and wrapping this up with going back to the UN, and power absolutely does play a role in it. I think anyone who says that states are actually equal under this is either naive or dishonest. Like with this case, with the vote for ending the arms embargo in Cuba. If you look really, really closely, you'll see, aside from the US, just Israel and a few island countries voted against it. And I don't know why Moldova felt the need to abstain, what they gained from it or anything like that. You know what? Good on Moldova for doing their own thing. I respect the independence. But if you even look at the US population, I'm sure a huge amount of Americans are for ending the embargo. Because, like I said, we already trade with communist countries. Vietnam and China are huge trading partners. Um, but there's a certain group of DC elites who have voter blocks in, especially South Florida, who this is their only issue. And they're able to effectively wield power, so that doesn't happen. And so the whole world can vote like this, that says the US should do something, but the US still gets to keep its territorial integrity, its sovereignty, its decision-making ability. So if the world votes like this is how the US responds.
You win? You have a problem with that? You know what you should do? You should sanction me. Sanction me with your army. Oh, wait a minute. You don't have an army. I guess that means you need to shut the fuck up. That's what I do if I don't have no army. I would fuck up. Shut the fuck up. That's right.
But yeah, quite funny. So overall, international law balances this autonomy and this capacity for self-determination, self-governance, or self-rule, and they give it up to other states for advantages, that social contract. So would you, as students in a group project, give up autonomy to each other? Would you give up autonomy to people around town? Well, the fact is that we do. We live in a society with rules. There's certain, even if no formal rules in your work groups, there's still norms that you abide and follow. Hopefully it's not a case where like someone just ghosts the entire semester, expecting the other people to do all the work. I think too highly of y'all to think that any of you do that. So we already do this to an extent. It's just to what level do we formalize it? And yeah, like I said, the best metaphor for any of this is speed limits. Everybody breaks the law a little bit. Even if you're not shining lasers in people's eyes or pepper spraying people, you've probably broken an international law at some point in your life. you've probably driven 5 miles over the speed limit. But the law really only tends to care when it gets to be egregious, and even then under very special circumstances. So we're going to leave it there. Hope you guys have a great rest of your weekend. I know I say this every Thursday, but go out, enjoy life, get your homework done. Let's all finish this semester strong. All right, see ya.